Okay, thank you, Tom, for that introduction. This will be an overview, and I'll go rather fast, and I'm aiming to get this done in 20 minutes or 25 minutes, but I'm going to cover a lot of material. So
I just want to say, though, that if people, I don't want you to feel under the gun, if people want to slow, is that all right, Steve? If people want to slow it down and say, hang on.
But if you do it too much, it's going to stretch it out. Okay.
We'll give you till lunch.
There is a lot of interest these days in some quarters in systemic solutions for systemic problems, and I think that system science and cybernetics are relevant, so let's just start with this quote from Bateson: "Major problems of the world are the result of the difference between how nature works and the way people think." And that theme will go throughout this, that it's not just a matter of understanding how the world works, but understanding how we're thinking and how that can impose constraints. Yeah, there's Gregory Bateson, for those who didn't know him.
Almost wore that shirt.
There are just two things I'd like to call to your attention. When I use the word cybernetics, there are some people who think computer science. That's not what I mean. What I mean is theory and philosophy, a very general theory and philosophy of control and communication that encompasses biological and social systems, including science. So if you think cybernetics, please don't. Also, when I refer to philosophy of science, which we're quite interested in at the present time, I have been told by my friends in philosophy of science, that's when I talk about philosophy of science, that's not what they mean by philosophy of science. So I'm trying to say conception of science. When I refer to philosophy of science, I'm saying this is my perception of how the scientific community is thinking about science. It's not what the philosophers are talking about. So I'm hoping that will help. Okay, now the framework that I'll be using operates on three levels. So you have the world, the foundation, which is technology, pollution, population, climate change, and so forth. Then you have science, descriptions of the world, and then you have philosophy or conceptualizations, ontology, epistemology, and so forth. And I'll be going back and forth among those levels. So the assumption that we operate on, I think, is that when we see a systemic problem, we look for a systemic solution by consulting science. But some systemic problems may lie in our conception of science, and we have trouble finding solutions because there are limitations in our conception of science. Now, one of the things I've found over the last 40 years of working in this field is that Europeans and Americans have a very different approach to science. We tend to assume that American science and European science are pretty much the same, that the United States is an offshoot of Europe, and so our basic assumptions are the same. In my experience, they're not. They're quite different. And the origin of the difference lies in the conception of philosophy. In the United States, philosophy is one of the humanities. It's over there with medieval French literature. In Europe, philosophy is the origin of all of the sciences. It's the queen of the sciences. So when you talk about philosophy to American scientists or these engineers, they don't know why you're going on about that. But when you talk about philosophy in Europe, they say, sure, of course, that's what we need to know. We need to understand it. Okay, so I'll just go over some current systemic problems. There's a lot of discussion about energy, environment, commercial civilization, per capita use of resources. You all are familiar with all of this. The governance problems are present. The number of failed states is growing. We have religious wars, migration due to violence, increasing inequality in incomes, weak governments in many countries, partly for the reason of these other problems. The global financial system is largely unregulated still, and we have inadequate theories of economic and social systems. If you don't have inadequate theories, your governance is not going to work very well. A lot of solutions have been proposed: carbon storage, educating women, use of process improvement methods, taking an entrepreneurial approach, There are many financial system reforms that have been proposed, and then you have websites that list all these various solutions to the global problematique. So there's a lot of thinking going on about this. Okay, so now let me get into systems and cybernetics, and I'll start with systems and then go into cybernetics. I had a doctoral student named Eric Dent who did a dissertation in management, and he came up with what I thought was quite an interesting idea, which is that in the systems field there are many schools of thought which are largely autonomous, and I will go over those. And he said, if you look at these, what you find is that there's some distinctions that the systems field made. And the systems field, I would maintain, emerged after World War II. You had a lot of people who went off to the war. They worked on practical problems, a wide variety of practical problems. They came back. They had a lot of new ideas. They wanted to talk about them. The Macy Foundation conferences was one of those. So the 8 distinctions that Eric Dent referred to was a change from reductionism to holism, from doing analysis to synthesis, from focusing on entities to focusing on relationships, from environment-free descriptions to including the environment in the description of what you're talking about, from order that is designed to order that is occurs automatically through self-organization, from deterministic to probabilistic systems, from systems composed of inanimate objects to systems composed of thinking participants, from linear causality to circular causality, from not paying attention to the observer to paying attention to the observer. So those are like 8 distinctions that people began thinking in terms of, and I would maintain that those 8 distinctions separate the prior disciplines from the systems disciplines. So they're useful in that sense. They provide a demarcation. They're also useful because they explain why the system sciences never came together. Because each group was working on some of those dimensions, but not all of them. And so they had trouble talking to each other and sharing perspectives. Now let me go through just a few of the systems fields to give you a sense of the variety. Okay, there's general systems theory. In the United States, that was based at the Mental Health Research Institute at the University of Michigan. James G. Miller, who wrote this big book, Living Systems, Anatole Rappaport, a game theorist, Kenneth Boulding, an economist, John Platt, a physicist, Richard Meyer, a chemist. They look for similarities among living systems and organizations in their matter, energy, and informational relationships. So they said any living system processes matter and energy and engages in informational activities or detection and so forth. And they emphasized levels of analysis. So you had cell all the way up to international organizations with similar processes occurring at each level. Then there was the systems approach, just a term they used. E.A. Singer Jr., a philosopher. Wes Churchman was a philosopher and management scientist. Russ Akoff, an architect and philosopher. Ian Mitroff became a management scholar. Their early work was in operations research during World War II. That would be logistics and things, queuing theory and things of that kind. And then they evolved over into facilitating conversations. Akoff invented something he called interactive planning. So they went from sort of an engineering, mathematical, and analytical approach to facilitating conversations among groups of people. Then there was a group called Organizational Learning that was mostly at Harvard and MIT. Chris Argyris in education, Donald Schoen in management, Peter Senge were out of that group. They based their work on the work of Ross Ashby and Gregory Bateson. So they included ideas from psychology, and they tried to make organizations work better. Then there was a group that worked on total quality management, which wasn't very closely connected with the systems and cybernetics literature. But I would maintain that that was the most influential management set of ideas in the late 20th century. It had huge impact around the world. And that was created by Stuart, Deming, Duran, Crosby, and others. And it was a fairly simple idea. They said, just think of an organization as a collection of processes. So you map out the process, you innovate. You see, come up with an idea how to improve the process, and then you use normal experimental methods. Does it work? Did it reduce the cycle time? Did it lower the error rate? Did it increase customer satisfaction? If it does, then you spread it through the organization. Then you come up with another idea and you test it. So it's an iterative process of testing innovations within an organization. At one point I worked on trying to get the School of Business at George Washington University to incorporate these ideas in the curriculum. And I was one of quite a number of people across the country who were doing this. And we were not successful. Basically, the problem was, I think, that in a business school you have different disciplines, finance, accounting, marketing, etc. This is an interdisciplinary set of ideas. It works for any process. So no one took possession of it. Everyone felt threatened by it. It didn't take root. But the corporations found it useful. So there was a wave of innovation in the creation of corporate universities, which is just an in-house training program. But process improvement methods became the core curriculum of these corporate universities. Just an interesting comment on the adoption or not of systemic innovations. Okay, another group were the system dynamicists at MIT under J. Forster. I assume you all have heard of this work, causal influence diagrams, computer simulations, the Club of Rome, the limits to growth. Industrial dynamics had to do with business cycles. Urban dynamics had to do with the, I think in the 60s or something like that, a Democrat would get elected to mayor and he or she would create programs for the poor. So the rich would move out, the poor would move in, the city would be impoverished. And the idea was to expand the boundary of the city so that the people who generate the revenue and the people who need the support would all be served. But that was what Forster talked about in urban dynamics. It was very controversial, but it attracted a lot of attention. And then world dynamics was the predecessor to the Club of Rome reports that put together all these trend extrapolation studies. So rather than extrapolating population or extrapolating oil production, he put it all together into one model, and that became the limits to growth, and it was very influential as well. Now they're working on teaching these methods in grade schools and high schools. Then there was artificial intelligence and robotics, which split off from cybernetics in 1956 at the conference at Dartmouth College, and I'll probably say something about that later. It was based at three places, MIT, Carnegie Mellon, and Stanford. Now it's every place. Okay, now I'm going to switch over to a history of cybernetics. So I've indicated how the system sciences were different from previous academic disciplines because they were making a set of distinctions that the previous academic disciplines tended not to emphasize. The early work in cybernetics, which continued to use the name cybernetics, was biological cybernetics, and that grew out of the work of Warren McCulloch at MIT, who had a big influence on Heinz von Forster, with whom I studied. Umberto Maturana was a student and collaborator with McCulloch. Wiener was a part of the group, and he gave the name cybernetics to the field, but he was not as much interested in cognition, I would say, as these others. So when Wiener and McCulloch died in the 60s, the Center of Cybernetics Activity moved to the University of Illinois, where I happened to be. That's Warren McCulloch, Umberto Maturana. Now, if you're interested in solving systemic problems, why do you want to study the brain? Well, this little quote from Abraham Lincoln came to mind. It says, "If I have 3 hours to chop down a tree, I'll spend the first 2 hours sharpening the blade." Meaning, if the brain is the principal tool that we use to solve problems, knowing how it works can be useful. Oops. So that's Norbert Wiener. Ross Ashby. Now these people came together, as was mentioned, at the Macy Foundation conferences in the late 40s and early 1950s in New York City. They had 1 or 2 conferences a year for a total of 10 conferences. There were no proceedings from the first 5. There were proceedings from the second 5. The editor of the proceedings was Heinz von Forster, and he was given that task because his English was so poor, they felt he needed to practice. And Margaret Mead looked over his shoulder and helped him, and his English became really, really very good.
He also wouldn't edit what people were saying.
He would not edit what other people. That's a good criterion. Thank you. Okay, now a new book has come out, which I was reminded of by the discussion. It's called The Cybernetics Moment, called Why We Call Our Age the Information Age. It's by Ronald Klein. He's a professor of the history of science and technology at Cornell University. And what he says is that in this period, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there was a lot of interest in information technology, cybernetics, and so forth. Why do we not call ourselves the cybernetic age? Why do we call it the information age? And his answer is, it's simpler. The concept of information is simpler for people to understand because you can, it sounds physical, it sounds like something you can store, it sounds like something that causes something else to happen. You can treat it linearly, and cybernetics, it's circular, it's kind of ambiguous, it's difficult. So that's his conclusion, and he goes into great detail about management information systems and things of that kind. So it's really a very useful book. But one of the things that he says is that cybernetics stopped in the mid-1970s. Well, the mid-1970s was when second-order cybernetics was invented. And so I said, well, physics didn't stop with quantum mechanics. Biology didn't stop with Darwin. So why would you say that cybernetics stopped with second-order cybernetics? I think he just wasn't familiar with it, but it's more subtle than that. And that is, American scientists use an epistemology of realism. European scientists know there are alternatives. And what McCulloch and von Forster were doing was saying, okay, we want to understand cognition. We have a collection of theories in the field of epistemology. Let's test them. We'll look at how the brain works and try to figure out which epistemology best describes what the brain does. And that was the origin of second-order cybernetics. So what that is, if first-order cybernetics is looking at the world, second-order cybernetics is looking back at the observer. You want to understand, how does the observer work? It works observing systems, systems which observe, or the fact of observing systems. Okay, that is second-order cybernetics. And also I would just say that although Warren McCulloch was the chair of those meetings, it was Bateson and Mead who were kind of managing them. And this is described very well in the Klein book, that Bateson and Mead, their agenda, I think McCulloch's agenda was to understand cognition, and Bateson and Mead wanted to use the mathematicians, the physicists, in the Macy conferences to enrich the conceptual models that the social scientists were using, because they were both social scientists. So they wanted to use circularity and basic scientific approaches to enrich the social sciences. That's me. That's von Forster. Now this is a set of neurophysiological experiments, which my students like. They find this persuasive. I find this persuasive. But if you've heard this, it's extremely boring. So I don't want to spend too much time on it because some people say, oh, yeah, that's that stuff again. But let me just point out that you've all heard of the blind spot, I assume. Okay, the blind spot is this spot on your retina where the optic nerve leaves the retina and there are no receptor cells. So anything that falls there you don't see. But you don't see that you don't see, because the brain fills in the space. And my image on your retina is upside down. The brain helps with that. There are many other examples that one can give. The point of all of these neurophysiological examples is to make the point that it is not physically possible to have an observation without an observer. But most science is based on the assumption that you can eliminate the observer. If you do the experiment correctly, everybody will see the same thing. We assume, but we don't, because we have different backgrounds, different personal histories. We come from different fields, different cultures, different languages. We don't see the same thing. We think, to a large extent, we see the same thing. We think we're seeing the same thing. But second order cybernetics is simply the cautionary statement, don't fool yourself into thinking that the way you perceive the world is the way the world really is. It's a construction. It works. It fits. But sometimes you have to change your views because it's not working. So second order cybernetics, it's a universal fallback position. When you're trying to do something and your best efforts aren't working, there's sort of two reactions you can take. You can blame people, you can yell at people, you can fire people, or whatever, or you can say, let's think about this again, and reflect, and try to come up with a different conceptualization. Okay. That's what I was just saying. Okay, so in the mid-1970s, Heinz von Forster started pushing the idea of second-order cybernetics. And I had just read Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and I thought, great, this is a scientific revolution. Let's go out and make a scientific revolution. It'll be fun. We'll get some papers published, you know. So what is the difference? Well, you have observed systems versus observing systems. That's von Forster. The purpose of a model versus the purpose of the modeler, Gordon Patz. Controlled systems versus autonomous systems, Francisco Varela. Or the interaction among the variables in the system versus interaction between the observer and the observed. Theories of social systems versus theories of the interaction between ideas and society. On this last one, let me just point out, in the physical sciences, engineering, when we deal with the world, we assume that our theories don't change what we're watching. And usually it doesn't. But in the social sciences, that's the whole point. You come up with a theory, you hope people will accept it, you act on the theory, and voila, the system changes. So that the history of economics is a series of innovations between theory and practice. But I don't think that idea is foundational yet within our conception of science. Okay, so you can think of three stages in the history of cybernetics. In the beginning, most of the applications were in the realm of engineering, computer science, artificial intelligence. And the progress was so spectacular and so exciting. I mean, think of all the robotic films and things like that, and the computers that we use and so forth, that the theoretical and philosophical stuff just vanished. Okay, then there was the interest in biological cybernetics, which I described briefly, that captivated the people who remained in cybernetics. But then over time there was a shift towards management and society and things like that. So there were like three different approaches to cybernetics that happened in the period between the 1970s up to the last decade or so. In the last decade or so, we focused on design and philosophy of science and conceptualization. So another way of thinking about this is that second order cybernetics added a third disciplinary view to the conception of science. That is, you have Karl Popper's realist view, conjectures and refutations, where the concern is to create reliable knowledge. Then you have Thomas Kuhn's sociological view, describing how scientists operate, and he dealt with the conflict between chaos in the original documents and smooth progress in textbooks. And then you have von Forster's biological view, the distinction between realism and constructivism. This is notion of which is primary, the world or the theory. American scientists have no doubt about that. The world is primary, and the theory is just a description, which can be wrong. You kind of have to test it. But if you go back to German idealism and Plato, the notion is that the theory is primary because you have immediate access to it. So when I say that tree is green, I'm talking about my perception. That there could be filters that make the tree look red, in which okay. So which is primary? Where does the error lie? The error might be in our senses. Okay. So you have these three views now of science. You have the normative view, the sociological view, and the biological view. That was an addition. And you can put them together in a kind of theory of epistemologies, rather than having separate epistemologies. This comes from Karl Popper's three worlds. So don't look at the numbers. The world is the external world that we observe. The observer is the internal mental representation in the mind of the observer. And then the scientific articles is the description. We store those up in libraries. So that's world one, world two, and world three. And the claim is that the original conception of science focused on creating valid descriptions of the world. Biological cybernetics and cognition looks at how the observer creates descriptions. And in pragmatics, good old American point of view, focuses on how does the observer operate in the world. The interesting thing is that in each point of view you focus on two things and explicitly neglect the third. So in the classical philosophy of science, you don't need to look at the observer. The observer vanishes, just do the experiment correctly, and everybody will see the same thing. In constructivism, you said you don't need to worry about the world because you've already got that in your mind. Okay, so don't worry about the world, just focus on your internal representations. And then in pragmatics, don't bother me with theories, just tell me what to do, how to act, and I'll act in the world, and I don't need those abstractions. But if you put them all together, you get a more comprehensive, more reliable, more well-founded view. Okay, now in Kuhn's book, he focused mostly on incommensurable definitions. If you recall, he talked about normal science and scientific revolutions, and he was primarily concerned with how do you go from normal science to a scientific revolution where you have incommensurable definitions, like mass, length, and time are fixed or they're not. And so you have to resolve that. He didn't really say how you resolve it. I think the way to resolve it is with the correspondence principle. That is, you reformulate your theory of physics, whatever it might be, so that you add a new dimension which goes to zero when you're not considering the new characteristic, like speed of light, okay, or the importance of the observer, or the effect of the theory on the phenomenon. If you don't think about those things, then you've got the original conception of science. If you add in a dimension, you have a larger conception. And that correspondence principle was invented by Niels Bohr at the time they were creating the quantum theory. And he said that any new theory should reduce to the old theory, to which it corresponds for those cases in which the old theory is known to hold, if you don't take account of the new dimension. So you can think that's the old conception of science. You add a new dimension, you have a new conception of science, and the great advantage of the correspondence theory is you don't lose anything. Everything you had before is still there, and all those data points support the new theory as well as the old theory. It's just that now you have a larger frame of reference, so you have additional problems you can deal with. So I would maintain that cybernetics expands science by adding these two dimensions, the amount of attention you pay to the observer, the effect of the theory of the phenomenon. We now have a theory of epistemologies that expands our conception of knowledge and science, how it's developed, where it comes from. And sometimes when I talk about cybernetics, and I say that, to me, cybernetics is to the social sciences what physics is to the engineering disciplines. That is, physics is a theory of matter and energy that underlies the engineering disciplines. Cybernetics is a theory of control and communication that underlies certainly the social sciences, but also part of biology and design and philosophy. And I think what people hear is scientism. You all know what scientism is, I assume. The inappropriate application of physical science concepts to social systems. Well, my view is that the social scientists are doing scientism, and cybernetics is an improved approach to the social sciences. Because cybernetics focuses on purposeful systems. Inanimate objects don't have purposes in themselves. We have purposes for them. But purposeful systems is something that's not encompassed, I would say, by physics, chemistry, and so forth. You just have transitions to equilibrium. So now we have a theory of purposeful systems at the individual, groups, organizations, nations, and we embody those principles in thermostats, cruise missiles, and things of that kind. So they're broadly applicable, the principles.
Can I just clarify one thing?
Yes?
So are you saying that the second order cybernetics does not follow the correspondence principle? Because
No, it does.
Then I'm kind of confused as to how that would happen. That is, if you actually include all three, I don't see that it ever can reduce back, or that what preceded it can reduce to that.
The new theory reduces to the old theory.
Yeah, but I don't see how that can happen if you've got.
Or you just pretend these considerations aren't important. That's what we do every day. Most scientists do it every day.
But that pretense is not the kind of reduction that Bohr was talking about. And it's just that there seems to be a bit of a hysteresis in moving from any two of the three to three of the three. That is, it's a jump that you can't just draw a line and say, I came from here to here, even though you've got a picture that might lure you into thinking that.
Well, possibly. I think we'd have to talk more about this because I'm having trouble.
The addition of the third fundamentally changes the other two, or actually, having all three together changes all three in a way.
I'd love to hear more about that.
Well, I mean, this is the kind of problem I'm sort of facing, and I thought it was very interesting that you reminded me of Bohr's.
It would work.
Bohr's
Maybe
principle.
It won't. Okay.
Sorry.
Can I for a few seconds? The problem is the picture he drew. If you instead draw it as going from a two-dimensional graph to a three-dimensional cube, so the third dimension is always orthogonal to the other two, then what happens is when you choose to ignore the third dimension, you're back on your two-dimensional plane and you reduce.
I completely understand that, but it seems to be an inappropriate or insufficient analogy to what actually happens when you go from a 2 to a 3. When you, go from an oriented view of the system that you've drawn and this disoriented view.
I suspect you're right. But
you're taking away the orientation when you go to all three. And that orientation was critical to any one of the other previous possibilities. So you can't reduce back to that.
I share Eric's skepticism here a bit. If you go to Kuhn's book, remember one of the examples he gives is the incompatibility of new chemistry and phlogiston chemistry. And the problem here is one cannot be reduced to the other. The correspondence principle does not hold, and one of the reasons why it does not hold is the question of terminology. And that is that you cannot express what pre-Lavoisierian chemistry said with the word oxygen. The very terms contradict and are incompatible with the old theory. There the correspondence principle could not hold.
Yeah.
That's a good example, yeah.
I mean, it passes right through phlogiston, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely correct. Yeah. Okay, let me get through this, and then we can have a general discussion, and I'll fade away. One of the reasons we came up with this notion of second-order science is because people were interpreting cybernetics as computer science. And we didn't want to talk about computer science. We wanted to talk about these larger issues. So he said, well, let's just talk about second-order science. And so that's what we've been doing lately. And then the philosophers began to object. So one thing that we've been emphasizing is that the scientist is inside the system observed as opposed to outside of the system observed. And there's another set of language that's come along, and that's reflexivity theory. There's several variations of reflexivity theory. And that implicitly assumes that the observer is inside the system and is acting on the system and then observes the consequences of his or her actions and then formulates another technique. And that's a kind of later version of circular causal and feedback mechanism. So reflexivity theory is one of the things we're working on as well. And what I would simply say here is that for a long time, people treated physics as the model of how you do science. I would say that physics is a special case of a larger